Well, I grew up in San Diego, and very close to the border. And so, as a boy, I used to take scuba diving and surfing trips down to Baja California all the time, and that was really my first exposure to Latin American culture. And immediately, I fell in love with it and the warmth of the people and everything about it. And obviously, the religion plays a very big role in their lives, more so than it did, at least with my acquaintances on the other side of the border. And so religion had always kind of fascinated me. And I'd spent some time in Latin America. I did a mission for my church for 2 years in Brazil. So I lived in the area for a while. And then when I came back, I started doing my undergraduate. I went to BYU, and I studied with Stephen Houston. And he is really, really great with Maya glyphs. And I remember in one of his classes, he says, you should really consider going and studying with Dr. Rebecca Horn up at the University of Utah, and because she translates Nahuatl. And of course, I had no idea what Nahuatl was. And so he says, it's Aztec. And I said, oh, yeah, that's interesting. He's like, if you're into the native cultures, if you're into understanding how it is that they process religion and come about, being converted in the evangelization process, that might be a good step. And so I went and I studied with her for 2 years, and she was a very gracious mentor, and hours and hours in her room or her office studying Nahuatl in between classes and things like this. And that's where I picked up the translation of the Nahuatl. And then I remember looking at for PhD schools, and she said, well, what would be really interesting is that if you could also compare what's going on with the Nahuatl with the Maya and what's happening in Yucatan. And Matthew Restall, who's done brilliant work with the Maya, he's at Penn State. You should go study with him. And so that's what I did. I went to Penn State and I studied with him. And that's where I learned the Maya. And so I could get a bit of a comparison to see how religion is so multifaceted and how it's distributed and delivered and conveyed to the native population. And so that's how all of this began, at least in my interests in it, and how it led me to where I am today. When the friars and the ecclesiastics first came over, the Franciscans wanted to use the sons of the native nobility and to train them and bring them into their schools, such as the College of Tata Loco, and really instruct them on religion and writing, and taught them everything. And the idea was these were going to be their assistants, right? And they were going to be, these native missionaries who would then go out and convey the word, and also, help them in their monasteries and everything like this, and their convents. And so one of the things that the native assistants learned how to do were to read and write their spoken language in the Roman alphabet. And these native assistants then would help ecclesiastics write religious texts, anything from sermons to catechisms. I mean, because you can imagine these friars and these ecclesiastics are coming over, and they don't really know much of the language. And as more and more come over, it helps them to be able to convey something of Catholicism to the native population if they already have sermons written or if they have confessional manuals, bilingual confessional manuals in Spanish or Nahuatl or Spanish and Maya. And it just helps in the training process of both the ecclesiastics and the natives. And so many of these texts were written. For years and years, we always assumed it was the Spanish author that appears in the title page, that they were the sole author. But as we come to understand it more and more, there were native aides who are editing, co-authoring, sometimes authoring these texts with the supervision of the ecclesiastics, and then also sometimes not under the supervision of the ecclesiastics. And so the question is, what do these texts say? If these are the texts that Nahuatls and Mayas are hearing, if these are the sermons that they're receiving, if this is at least part of the message that they are getting, what does this message say? And so translating these texts, translating these sermons, these catechisms, these confessional manuals from the Nahuatl or Maya into English really allows us a better appreciation of what the language is, of what the message is. And so that's in a large part of what my research is. And then I compare, does a catechism in the mid 16th century say the same thing in, the late 18th century? And if it changes, why? And why is the message different? Or why is the message different in Central Mexico than it is in Yucatan? Or, why in, Guadalajara are they saying, emphasizing certain aspects in the confession and they're not in Merida? And so it's interesting to get kind of these local perspectives of Catholicism and come to a better appreciation that there isn't just, one kind of monolithic Catholicism that everyone's receiving, but it's different. They're essentially tailored, locally made Nahuatl and Maya Catholicisms. And the text that I found in the archives of BYU recently speaks to this. So it was a very fortuitous find. I had gone there trying to see what part of the Gates collection they had acquired between Tulane and Princeton. BYU got a little portion of it. I'd always wanted to kind of see what they had, and I went there and was kind of rummaging through things. And as I was mentioning earlier, Nahuatl and Maya texts usually have a way of becoming miscatalogued because of the language issue. And so they had something in their collection called a Maya Doctrina, or a Maya Catechism. And so I looked at it and very quickly realized it wasn't a catechism. It was a different text altogether. I was meeting my family for lunch in about an hour, so the archivist was very generous. He let me take digital photos. I took them back, to my office and looked at the manuscript in more detail later. And as I started going through it and conversing with various scholars, Matthew Restall and Victoria Bricker and David Bowleys, and looking at different opinions of what this might be, came to the understanding that this was a Maya, what I'm calling a Maya Christian copybook. It's a copybook that contains various Christian texts within it that has been preserved locally by the town of Tiabo. And I know it's from Tiabo because there's certain death records at the end that were recorded from that town. And it kind of opens up this whole issue of when the Maya are writing of their own accord, or the Nahuatl for that matter, what is it that they write about? Which Christian texts do they find interesting enough to put in their own manuscripts that aren't necessarily for the eyes of ecclesiastic authorities? And in fact, technically, they weren't supposed to be writing these things on their own and keeping them away from the ecclesiastics. So, when they are doing this, what is it that they're writing? What part of Christianity appeals to them the most, or at least to the point where they want to record them in these books, in these town copybooks? And so that's the value I think of this manuscript. It really allows you to see what it is that they are adhering to. In the beginning, you have a commentary of the creation of the world, what Victoria Bricker has called a Genesis commentary. And it's not a straight translation of Genesis. It is a creative redaction, a creative reinterpretation. It's a story. And like any story, a storyteller can always add to it a bit and tell it in a different way, emphasize certain parts that he or she thinks is most important. And so it changes a bit from text to text. But similar redactions can be found in other books of which scholars have called the books of Chilam Balam, which are locally preserved manuscripts that have anything from calendrics to medicine to religious texts in them. It's different from the Maya Christian copybooks in that Maya Christian copybooks are strictly religious texts that look to be used for a didactic purpose. You're going to find, the sermons, everything in there is going to have something to do with preaching Christianity. At any rate, so it has a Genesis commentary, then it kind of slides into a genealogy of Christ, his second coming. We have the 15 signs before doomsday, this medieval text, popular in Europe, is now appearing in this Maya manuscript. It's actually appeared in a few Maya manuscripts and some Nahuatl ones as well. And then a couple of other religious discourses at the end. There are this manuscript appears to be a late 18th century copy of an earlier original. And it's been preserved over time, and at the very end you can find someone who's written in pencil some various medicinal remedies, just kind of in the margins and in the end, and then some death records as well. And so it's a very interesting manuscript. It was a very fortuitous find, primarily for what I mentioned earlier, the fact that it really kind of gives us a better idea of what these towns are preserving, what they find important enough to preserve year after year in their own town of Christianity. So the Maya Christian copybooks would be used, it would be preserved in the town, and they would be used for the education of the Maya, the sons of the Maya nobility in these schools, and they would either be, read to these sons and helping them in their, training in the Christian doctrine, or just locally preserved in the town, very similar to a Chilam Balam. It's an important document, important record, and you're just going to preserve these things. And so they could also be read, in a town gathering. How exactly they are used, we don't really have many sources telling them what they actually did with these things, but we can make educated guesses. What we do know is that they were absolutely important enough to keep around, and also important enough that similar texts will appear in other locally preserved manuscripts. Like I mentioned, many of the texts in this Maya Christian copybook from Tiabo also appear in the Chilam Balams, and so there's some coordination there. The Florentine Codex was a project that Fray Bernardino de Sahagún undertook to understand better the Nahua culture, in hopes to better evangelize the Nahuas. And so you have everything from, details on what people did in daily life to what, a metal worker would do, to aspects of their religion and their deities. Anything and everything is in the Florentine Codex. And this was something spearheaded by the Franciscans, by Sahagún, as I mentioned, to better evangelize the Nahua. Now, how that relates to a Maya Christian copybook, as you asked, is I'll try to make the connection. One, we can see just the importance of writing in general, right? The importance of understanding the culture, of understanding who it is that you're actually preaching to, and that's where you're getting a lot of the Franciscan initiative in the Florentine Codex. But the Maya Christian copybooks, these are the Maya who have been trained by the friars and ecclesiastics on how to read and write, and they are now not writing because they have been told to, say, make a record of the Genesis, of the account in Genesis, or to record a certain sermon because an ecclesiastic asked them to. They're doing this because this is something that means something to them, and so they're doing it on their own. And so so the similarities, they're both written in native languages. They both help us understand aspects of native culture, but one of the huge differences is one is being written outside of this direct supervision of ecclesiastics, while the other one is. And so it gives you, again, kind of a better insight on, when you're on your own, what part of Christianity do you adhere to the most, and what means the most to you. And that's always, we can't get inside people's hearts and minds, right? It's always the very difficult aspect of what a religion means to somebody. And of course, these Maya Christian copybooks are not, kind of the crystal ball into that realm. However, they do give us another step further into that dimension in helping us clarify that aspect of it. There's a new interesting correlation with a new kind of wave of scholarship coming out. A new wave of scholarship that falls under what has been termed the New Conquest history, and it's at the heart of its argument is looking how the conquistadors weren't just Spaniards, and how the natives participated in many of the conquest endeavors, and how the natives themselves saw themselves in many cases as conquistadors, and how they are very much a part of writing this narrative and this part of history. And so much of it has been done on kind of the physical conquest, and there's other avenues being explored now as we speak. But it's interesting if then you take this to what has been termed by Robert Ricard as the spiritual conquest, right? The spiritual conversion of the peoples. The more we see the influence of native assistants, native religious stewards in conveying the religious message. And so, in many cases, the natives were writing these sermons and these catechisms. And so in a sense, the Christian message that other natives are receiving, it's not coming from a Spaniard, it's coming from a Nahua or a Maya. And it helps us understand their role in the conversion process. If you were to look at your very kind of typical image of the spiritual conquest, you might see a Spanish priest, talking down to a native fold. But we have to consider the numerical differences and the demography of everything. That the priests were vastly outnumbered. They couldn't be in every single native town, and they relied on these native assistants who they have trained to go back to their towns and to administer emergency baptisms, or to help them evangelize the native population, and basically in many ways be surrogate priests. And so for a majority, for at least a large amount of the natives, the Christian message to them was being presented by fellow natives, and not so much a Spaniard. Now, yes, the Spaniards were there, but they would come by, and they would they would marry and do the sacraments and so on and so forth. But your everyday interaction, your common face of Catholicism was more of a native face than it was a Spanish face. And I think the more we understand these texts, the more this becomes more relevant. And if you go into the native communities today, it's very much the same. You have natives who have been entrusted by the priests, and the priests themselves will tell you that they're absolutely essential to running the church, to the education, to helping things run smoothly. I mean, they're a very important part of the church. And so one important then contribution of all of this is really coming to better understand the amplified role of the natives in their own conversion. This is very much, very similar to the physical conquest. This is very much, and I don't want to say that they're conquering each other spiritually, but at least in the evangelization process, the natives played a larger role than I think that we have hitherto understood, or at least appreciated. And so that's another new dimension that I think is important to recognize. I was a missionary with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I spent 2 years, preaching Christianity. And so how this kind of then relates to how I see these texts, it's interesting because I've seen myriad levels of the conversion process, right? And I've seen how the different levels of how we engage with religion. And religion is something that our relationship with it is something that you negotiate every day. It is something that changes every day. If you were to lose your job today and you happen to be a religious person, a Christian, I promise you that you'll probably be on your knees that night, saying some pretty fervent prayers. You might attend, your church a little bit more frequently. When things are going good, maybe not so much. And so you get to see this a lot. And you get to see what aspects, and the point is, what aspects in daily life lead us to either convert, perhaps isn't the best word, but to adhere to religious beliefs. And so in 2 years traveling in Brazil, you get to see a lot of different circumstances, and you get to understand why it is the various circumstances that people will adopt religion, and how much of it they allow to enter into their own lives. And so when I study the Nahua and Maya, obviously we're looking at, in many cases, apples and oranges here, but it's interesting for me to, and perhaps this is why I got into this field, right? I like to try to understand a little bit more the conversion process, why it is that the Nahua or Maya would accept these things. How much of Christianity are they adapting, and why? What aspects of it appeal to them? And so going back to this Maya Christian copybook, the Maya seem to be drawn to the creation story, and also the 15 signs before doomsday. I see this in numerous Maya texts, and it seems to pop up over and over again. And so that this concern with the creation and also the end of the world, and this is something that resonates deeply in Maya culture, kind of the cyclical creation and period beginnings and endings, and the Katun counts and all of these different things. This is something familiar to them. And so it's an aspect of Christianity that still allows them to preserve a little bit of their own culture, their own cultural beliefs, of their own lifestyle even, while adopting to this new and strange and foreign religion. And so, going back to your original question of how this might, relate to my own experience as a missionary, I've been able to see that. Whenever religion kind of coincides with pre-existing beliefs, or coincides with the culture, or the practices of an individual, it's easy. These are the aspects of religion that they seem to adopt the most, because that makes more sense to them, and it's more familiar. On another completely different level, I sympathize and have nothing but the utmost respect for these ecclesiastics with this daunting task of having to translate a Christian message into another language, and concepts for which many of the, in the Nawa culture, such moralistic concepts didn't exist. Kind of the eternal damnation of sin, and these types of things. The idea of a one true God, and all of these different type of foreign concepts. And so I can only imagine how difficult that must have been. In my own experience in Brazil, the vast majority are already Christians, and so we're already starting on some basic level. But to start completely foreign, and then try to figure out how to take that message and put it into a native tongue is just absolutely astounding. And so I see these Nawa and Maya manuscripts, many of which absolutely did come from ecclesiastics, or at least were sponsored by them or commissioned by them, and the efforts and the work that went into them is nothing but admirable, and just I'm grateful it wasn't me. Let me just put it that way.